Welcome to Mr. Frueh Knits, a vlog about knitting. Today's episode is going to be about learning. Learning to knit, learning to vlog, maybe. When it comes to vlogging, I realize that I don't have my stash or anything really interesting behind me. I could try balancing my stash on my shoulders, but I don't think that's really gonna, that's not, But I would like to talk about how I learned to knit. So I think the place to start is my earliest exposure to knitting, which was through my grandmother. She's always knitting or crocheting, and at some point or another, she definitely taught me how to crochet, I think. Just a little simple chain. I think that's all I was doing. I don't think I graduated to knitting, but I definitely learned an appreciation of knitting. Maybe not as much as I should have had. And actually, she made this for me. This is one of the things that she made. I don't know that she was following a pattern exactly. She's just basically familiar. She's been knitting for forever. She's familiar with all the various cabling, and she's made lots of sweaters, so she knows how to put it together. So this is a sweater that she made for me that I haven't worn in recent years as much as I should have. It does maybe not have as many short rows in the back of the neck, so that it sort of comes up here a little uncomfortably, but it's a great piece of work. And it's far from the only thing Graham has knit that we have in our house. So this is an Afghan that she's crocheted that is just really lovely. And she has gone and, after crocheting it, done some cross-stitch flower motifs. She's also, in the bottom corner here, stitched in the year that she made it in, her initials and my initial. I also have a number of well-worn, well-loved socks that she's made me over the years that are great to throw on in the middle of winter to keep your toes warm while you're sitting in front of the TV and knitting. So yeah, my grandmother is a very skillful knitter, but I didn't really learn how to knit from her, which I always feel kind of sad about. But I think I can't be the only young-ish knitter in this situation who had a grandmother who was or an older relative who was very skillful at knitting, but who they never really learned it from until they went away to college or moved and somehow got into it. I think a lot of us have this sort of interrupted transmission of the knitting skill, which on the one hand is too bad, but the way I sort of try to approach it is to really try to appreciate the things that my grandmother has made for me, and to the extent I can participate in knitting with her. So I like to, for Christmas or her birthday, to go to one of my local yarn stores and pick out a really nice, brightly colored yarn that she wouldn't be able to too easily find at home, and send it to her. So where does my knitting learning begin? And really, there have been two phases of knitting for me. The first was in college. I started dating a girl who knit, and I learned a bit from her, and I really enjoyed it, although I wasn't very good at it. So as far as enjoying it, I found an old picture on Facebook from 2005 of me knitting at a social event. I mean, that's the stamp of a true knitter. For that Christmas, I knit a few members of my family things. I think I knit my mom a sweater, and I knit my brother a hat, which he still has, and it's the worst thing I've ever seen. He very kindly sent me some footage he shot of it, and I don't know what this is, what all these colors are, but you don't really get the true sense of it until you see how enormously huge it is. His anonymity is very carefully protected here by the hat. And I mean, I knew it was this big. I knew it was way too big. And I still gave this thing as a Christmas gift with that weird dimple on top. I think what I wound up doing was running a drawstring around the quote unquote brim for him to cinch it around his head. I don't know what I was thinking. So that relationship, the girl who taught me how to knit, eventually ended, and for the time, so did my first phase of knitting, if only because I was mostly using her needles. I didn't have any of my own kit, so I couldn't really keep on doing it. Then years later, I started dating the woman who's now my wife, uh, and she was a very avid knitter. We'd be sitting at home watching Netflix or whatever, and she'd be knitting, and I would really be paying more attention to her knitting than I was to the TV show because it was still really interesting to me. I think the thing that really got me back into it was a trip we took some vacation to Tokyo to visit a friend. And in his neighborhood in Kichijoji, there was a yarn shop selling all of these wonderful colors of yarn, including some which were silk, sort of recovered silk yarns. One skein really caught my eye. I really loved the color, and I picked it up and said to my wife, maybe I'll buy this skein of yarn here and knit it into something as a souvenir. Could you teach me how to knit? So really, me getting back into knitting had everything to do with me finding a yarn that I really liked that I wanted to make something out of. And I still have it. Here it is, the thing that I made. It's a cowl, kind of a longish one, and it goes over my head pretty tightly, which is why I have to take my glasses off. Woo. Yeah, it's very, well, it's almost hard to describe the color because it changes quite a bit depending on what the lighting conditions are. So in natural light like this, it looks very purple. In other lighting conditions, it looks more blue. It's very, it's an irregular kind of spin. So there's some bits that are super thick and some bits that are much thinner. To say it has a halo is an understatement. It's got a lot of very lovely, subtle variegation and other color combinations. But I must say, this is not a yarn that I would pick up now, that I would be drawn to now. The color is wonderful, but the shagginess of it, the irregularity of its weight is not what attracts me to yarn anymore. I mean, I like something that will show off my ability to be consistent, something that has good stitch definition, a yarn that plays well with others, that doesn't just dominate the garment it's in. But I'd also say this was a great starting yarn for a starting project because this is the first thing I ever knit. My gauge was not super consistent, and I'm sure I've got yarn overs in here and all the other sort of mistakes that you make on your first garment, but you can't really see it for all the shagginess and the irregularity of the yarn. It hides those errors pretty well. So not a bad yarn to start my first project ever. So in this second phase of my knitting life, I made that cowl and I made a few socks and a few more failed projects, I would say, experimenting with things, figuring out what works for me, what doesn't, learning how to become more consistent. But I'd say the thing that really changed my knitting life was moving to Edinburgh. So I live in Edinburgh, Scotland now, where there is a very active knitting community. I became a social knitter. We started going to a regular knit night. And as much as I may have learned how to knit from my wife or from online tutorials, I've also learned a lot socially from my knit night, spending time with people who have been knitting for a long time. We all acquire different skills and then sort of share them. It's hard for me to say exactly what I've learned from who, but I've learned a lot, and my knitting now is so much different than it used to be. For example, here's a hat I made shortly after we arrived in Edinburgh. It's mixing honeycomb cabling and some red yarn in a kind of interesting way, but it's all still kind of big. The fabric is very tight. I could have used larger needles on it, fewer stitches, and there's just little details that are not so great. At the round join, it's just kind of a mess down there. But this is basically where I was at when we first moved here. In comparison, here's a hat I've just recently finished. It's also a cabled hat. This is Far Hills by Jared Flood. And this is much more like a for real hat. Fits my head just right. The fabric isn't too tight. I've just gotten to be a better knitter. Part of that might be because I've started using patterns more than I ever used to. This hat, I just sort of made up as I went along, which, you know, it produced a hat, it goes on my head, keeps my ears warm, but there's all these little details that I sort of made up when I got to them. Whereas this, of course, Jared Flood, major designer, puts a lot of time and effort into planning all these little details of every pattern. So why did I start using patterns more often than just making it up, winging it as I went along? That really does come down to me joining my knitting group. That's what everybody there basically does. They're always using patterns, and I learned a bit about, you know, what are better patterns, who are known designers, what kind of yarn do people really like using. It's had a big effect on maybe my taste. And of course, you learn a lot from using patterns too. Little techniques that you didn't know would be useful or attractive looking. You do it because it says so in the pattern, then you realize, oh, that's a pretty cool technique, and you can use it again. This, for example, is a glove that I made on the fly, sort of like that hat, right? Made it up as I went along. It's a much better object because I learned a lot doing other patterns. For example, I've got a tubular cast on in the round here at the bottom, which I learned from a pattern. I've got the twisted rib here in the cuff because I realized, hey, that looks pretty good from a pattern. I wouldn't say that I learned the antler cable from a pattern, but one thing I have learned is to not do too much all at once. Sometimes a simple motif like this antler pattern on the back on its own is going to wind up looking good, and you don't need to go doing something like incorporating more colors into what could be just fine. This could be just a fine honeycomb hat. I didn't need to add the red. Another really great thing about living in Edinburgh, though, of course, is the Edinburgh Yarn Festival, which we didn't know about before we lived here, and we're just so lucky to have it on our doorstep. And this year, I had my first experience taking an actual knitting class. I took a class on finishing techniques with Bristol Ivy, and there's all the notes I scribbled down. And I have to say, I'm a big believer in the face-to-face classroom learning format. It's one thing when you're at home working on a pattern, you don't understand the technique, then yeah, pull up Very Pink Knits. You're going to have the technique there, and it's going to be an excellent YouTube tutorial, and you'll get it. But it's a very different experience to have an experienced designer there going around, giving people individual attention as they need it, and being able to pick their brain about the specific techniques you're doing. So, for example, I just recently learned that you're not supposed to tie knots in your ends when you're finishing. I just didn't know. Nobody just tells you that. Anyway, so I was in the class learning how to tie in my ends using duplicate stitch embroidery, and I could just ask Bristol Ivy, how many stitches do you go until you decide to call it a day? So I guess for me, learning to knit has been a lot about relationships, whether it's my relationship with my grandmother or romantic relationships or the friends I've made through knitting. That's what a lot of me learning to knit has been about. And I guess I'd say if you're somebody thinking about learning to knit or wanting to improve your knitting, there's a handful of things from my experience so far that I think could be useful. First, I'd say find something that you're excited to make or some yarn that you're excited to work with. That's what was important to me, finding that wonderful purple yarn in Tokyo. Next, I guess I'd say accept that you're going to make some really bad things to begin with. Uh, and even if it's not really bad things, you're going to make some functional but not the most beautiful things. I'd also say go ahead and join a knit night or a knitting group. Even if it's not a group set up specifically to teach people how to knit, you inevitably share techniques with each other. It's going to have an effect of improving your knitting. Also, be on the lookout for well-written patterns, because a well-written pattern will not only help you make the object you're working on well, but it'll also teach you things that you didn't know before. And finally, not to knock all of the excellent YouTube tutorials that there are out there. You can really teach yourself a lot using YouTube tutorials, but definitely be on the lookout for classes happening at your local yarn store or yarn festivals. Being there with somebody who is there specifically to teach you how to do the thing, and when you can have an interaction, that is invaluable. So that's it for Mr. Frueh Knits. Take care, everybody. Next time, I'm going to be talking about how we talk about yarn. See ya!